Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's always a hot button issue: freedom of speech. We all think we're pretty well versed on the concept, but what if we told you there's a compelling argument against absolute freedom of speech? That's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got excerpts from an article titled Against Free Speech, and let me tell you, it's going to challenge some deeply held assumptions. Get ready for some aha moments as we unpack this unconventional perspective and explore why someone might actually advocate against the very thing we hold so dear. Right off the bat, the article argues that absolute freedom of speech, the kind where anything goes, simply doesn't exist. And you know what? They make a pretty good point. Think about it. We have laws against child pornography, right? It's a clear example of a limitation on speech and one that most people would agree is justified to protect vulnerable individuals. Then there's the question of blasphemy laws. While they might seem like something from another era, they're still very much a reality in many parts of the world. Even in places like Canada, certain types of speech, particularly those considered hateful or discriminatory, can land you in legal trouble. So, right from the get-go, the author highlights that limitations on speech already exist, even in societies that pride themselves on freedom of expression. But here's where things get really interesting. The author makes this bold claim, and this is where you might want to put on your thinking caps, that free speech, along with many other values we cherish, could actually be tools of control.
Oh, yeah.
Right, sounds a little like a conspiracy theory, but hold on, let's unpack this further with our expert.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's easy to kind of fall into that trap of thinking of freedom of speech as like you just get to say whatever you want, whenever you want.
Right.
But this article really kind of challenges that in a fascinating way.
You're telling me. The whole tools of control idea has me intrigued, but I'll admit I'm a little lost on how that works in practice.
Well, the author argues that true freedom isn't just about having a voice. It's about having the capacity to use that voice effectively.
Mm.
And they frame freedom as less of a birthright and more of a skill that you develop over time.
Okay, freedom as a capacity. So it's not just about what we're allowed to say, but what we choose to say and how we say it.
Precisely. Think about it in terms of personal growth.
Hmm.
We often talk about freeing ourselves from like limiting beliefs or negative thought patterns.
Right.
Right. It's an ongoing process of self-reflection and refinement. And the authors suggest we should kind of view freedom of speech through a similar lens.
So instead of shouting into the void, it's about focusing our speech, choosing our words carefully, and maybe even pausing before we react.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about moving away from those impulsive reactions and that kind of meaningless noise towards more intentional and impactful communication.
That actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've all seen how social media can devolve into these shouting matches. It's like having unlimited free speech sometimes makes it harder to be heard, not easier.
Yeah, and that feeds into the author's next point, which is perhaps even more unsettling. They argue that this feeling of having a voice, this illusion of free speech within a controlled system, might actually make us less likely to take meaningful action.
Hold on, I need a second to wrap my head around that. How could having a voice make us less likely to act? Isn't speaking out the first step towards change?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But think about it this way. If we believe we're free to express ourselves, even if those expressions are ultimately inconsequential, we might be less inclined to challenge the very system that allows for that expression in the first place.
So it's like we're so busy enjoying our freedom to speak that we don't realize we might be stuck on a hamster wheel of pre-approved narratives. We think we're being heard, but are we really making a difference?
That's the question the author wants us to consider. They argue that in a truly controlled system, even our dissent might be carefully calculated, a pressure valve that ultimately reinforces the existing power structure.
Wow. Okay, that is a lot to unpack. So if we accept that we're operating within this controlled system, what's the alternative? What does the author propose we do with this information?
Well, this is where things take a very unexpected turn. They bring up the concept of a monarchy.
A monarchy. Now, that's not a solution you hear every day, especially in the context of free speech.
I know it seems completely counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But the author's point is not to advocate for like a return to absolute monarchy or anything like that. It's more about challenging our assumptions about how power and communication intersect.
So walk me through this. How could a monarchy, a system often associated with limited individual liberties, possibly be a better model for meaningful speech?
The author suggests that in a monarchy, the relationship between the ruler and the ruled is, in theory, more direct. Instead of relying on representatives or navigating these complex bureaucratic systems, you could hypothetically just take your grievances straight to the top.
So less emphasis on public discourse and more on direct appeals to authority. Interesting. But wouldn't that system be prone to corruption or favoritism? What's to stop a monarch from just ignoring the needs of the people?
That's where the author brings in this concept of equality of ruled and ruler. And it's not about the monarch being all powerful or anything like that, but rather about both the ruler and the ruled being accountable to some higher power or principle.
So whether it's divine law, a constitution, or some other guiding principle, there's an understanding that even the king isn't above the law.
Exactly. And it's this shared accountability, this recognition of a higher authority, that supposedly fosters a different dynamic between those in power and those they govern. The author argues that this system, at least in theory, allows for more honest and impactful communication.
It's a really fascinating concept, but even if we entertain this idea of monarchy as a model for speech, it still feels like a far cry from the world we live in today. And frankly, the author doesn't seem overly optimistic about the future of free speech in our current system either, does he?
Yeah, you're right. The article isn't exactly like a glowing endorsement of the future of free speech as we understand it. The author seems to suggest that as our current systems evolve and perhaps become even more centralized, our relationship with free speech will continue to shift as well.
So are we headed toward a future where those acceptable boundaries we talked about earlier become even more rigid, where dissent is increasingly marginalized, even if it appears we have the freedom to express it?
That's the open question the author leaves us with. They're not advocating for any specific outcome, but rather just encouraging us to critically examine the forces that shape our ability to express ourselves.
It's a call to awareness, isn't it? It's about recognizing that free speech, however we define it, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's constantly being shaped by technology, social norms, and yes, even political systems. Well, this deep dive took us down some unexpected paths. We went from child pornography and blasphemy laws to questioning the very nature of freedom, and even pondering the merits of monarchy. Talk about a thought-provoking conversation. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that free speech is far more nuanced and complex than we often realize. It's not just about having a voice. It's about understanding the power of words, the systems that amplify or silence those words, and the responsibility that comes with using our voices effectively. So here's something to ponder as you go about your day. If our words have the power to shape reality, to influence not just our own lives, but the world around us, how can we use them more intentionally? How can we move beyond simply expressing our opinions and towards creating meaningful dialogue and positive change? It's a question worth considering. Until next time, happy diving.